Devotion from Joshua looks at a detail in the Hebrews' journey from slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Promised Land that's often overlooked. This detail takes place after they have crossed the Jordan River, but before they have begun to conquer the land. And yet this detail brings up for us, whose hope is in Christ, a comforting and encouraging lesson. Listen to Joshua 5:10 through 12. While the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month in the evening on the plains of Jericho. And the day after the Passover, on that day, they ate of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes, and parched grain. And the manna ceased the day after they ate of the produce of the land. And there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. This is when God's earthly provision for manna from heaven stopped. It stopped after they had begun to eat of the riches from the land of promise. It was tied to the feast of Passover, more specifically, the day after the feast. Passover was to remind them of God's amazing grace in preserving their lives from the destroyer that went through Egypt just before they were released from their bondage. And now, after arriving in the promised land and partaking of the riches of that land, the supply of earthly manna that God had given ceased. Why? Because they had at last arrived. Do you see where I'm going with this? For us who hope in Christ and his resurrection, we have God's gift of faith to live by while we sojourn on earth, as the Hebrews lived on manna for their sojourn in the wilderness. Yet when we receive the fulfillment of Jesus' promise of being with him in heaven, we will no longer live by the gift of God of faith. We will have the fulfillment of the promised land of heaven and have no more need of the manna of earthly faith. We will eat of the bounty from God's feast table forever and ever. Never forget that God provides for our needs on earth to prepare us for his complete fulfillment of our needs there in heaven. I'm sure that there were times when the Hebrews tired of manna and of wandering in the desert, yet God never left them go hungry. He provided for them, and that provision was also preparation for what was to come. Never forget this little detail, that God, by his gift of faith to us, both provides for us here and prepares us for being there with him. God's peace to you today. Goodbye.